I've given this talk several times before, and it's been suggested to me, some kinds, friendly, sometimes not so friendly, this should come with an advisory. I tend to get very excited about this, as I know many of you do as well. I'm going to be making in the next 12 minutes a bunch of really grand, whopping generalizations that those of you who know much more about it will go, wait a minute. But that's good, that's the conversation we want to have. And it's going to be mildly heretical. Maybe not so much for this audience and this group, I'm hoping, but certainly for the professional context and networks in which I work, I articulate points of view that sometimes are at odds with my colleagues. Matt Miller in The Tyranny of Dead Ideas tells us about the importance of having organizational heretics. The Casey Foundation is actually one of those organizations that actually believes that and has at least humored me so far in doing this. My optics. I'm an anthropologist. I've been working in philanthropy for the last 10 years, but I was trained as a cultural anthropologist, actually first as an archaeologist, which means, and some habits die hard and others haunt the living for eternity, and my anthropological training has really focused me on a bunch of things: the importance of language, the importance of context in its various senses, the importance of history, a sense of important to think about holistically and in terms of systems, but a set of systems that is maybe different from folks with an ecological background. I'm really focused not only on how social systems and how human beings organize themselves into collectivities, but systems of belief. And it's these systems of belief and ideas that, if resilience is indeed an attribute of systems, I don't think we've really explored what makes a belief system resilient in response to vast kinds of devastating change. Also, one of the things that struck me, I'm very attuned to language and metaphor, people have talked about the city as a system of systems, and I think this is a way too tidy notion, because it sort of assumes that if we just figure out the system dynamics and how to integrate it, it becomes a more orderly place. And in fact, the city in particular is a place where a whole bunch of systems have been mashed together. They're not necessarily directly or intentionally connected. And there's a lot of noise associated with it. We live in a forest, a riot, a crazy carnival of systems, and sometimes it's very appealing to sort of just take some out and just basically say they're noise and not pay attention to that. But I think it's important to do that, and part of it, thinking about the kind of a problem a city is, Jane Jacobs talked about it as a problem of organized complexity. I think one of the things that we've really not attended to within discourses of community development and urban development and sustainability and resilience is to talk about the way in which the city is an imaginary construction, which doesn't mean it's not real, but that the city is a product of both our individual and collective imaginations. And this is something that is, that affects the way in which we can think of and actually do things within the city. The soft city that Jonathan Raban talks about here, I think there's an unspoken assumption that big data and the development of new technologies of communication have eradicated the soft city and replaced it with the hard city of data. In fact, I think we've just created far more dimensions of softness without necessarily recognizing it. I go to a lot of conferences in the course of my job. And about 3 years ago, I began noticing that resilience was popping up everywhere. We're talking about resilient communities, resilient societies, resilient economies, resilient nations. And I was like, okay, I was familiar with the concept in psychology and ecology, but where did this come from? How did this arrive and be articulated by the Federal Reserve Bank and the Rockefeller Foundation, the New America Foundation, MacArthur? And certainly it was definitely a response to 9/11 and our recognition that we live in this era of uncertainty and volatility. And there's a certain amount of intuitive appeal to resilience. No one wants to be vulnerable or brittle, although we often quite are. So it's a concept that's good to think. But it's also something that occurs in multiple registers. There are multiple definitions. There are multiple senses. Part of it is resilience a process? Is it an attribute of systems? Is it a quality of individuals or units? Is it an outcome? Is it a language? Is it merely a metaphor? And so I think there's always going to be that kind of indeterminacy, particularly as the concept gets drawn up into widespread usage, as it has been, and become unfortunately designated as, quote unquote, a buzzword, which is usually the kiss of death for any kind of concept. It means you don't get to take it seriously and it's just a sort of passing fad. I think resilience has the possibility to be a new anchoring concept or a way of looking at things about bringing together perspectives from a wide variety of disciplines, and that's what excites me about it to a tremendous amount. Also, I think there's a degree of radicalism in the notion of resilience. Part of it, is thinking about this bouncing forward notion. What we're talking about here is not just a return to past states, but this completely set of new states that in fact could be very, very different from what has been organized in the past, although there's a whole set of institutional processes and inertia that I think really constrain our ability to imagine, much less do, building things towards this new state. It's also not quite clear to me whether or not resilience is a scientific paradigm or a social movement. Talking about it as a moral imperative seems to have aspects of both. And once you start moving into social movement territory, it does not follow the laws and logics of scientific paradigms. And it's also, I think, somewhat overly focused on the big event about the next disaster, hurricane, earthquake, or have you, when it seems that one of the true tests and one of the true challenges of resilience is how to deal with the smaller, more chronic, enduring sets of shocks that in time can, just with a slight touch, move into something really, really big. And also, it's about what's the relationship between resilience and concepts not only like sustainability, but equity and environmental justice and efficiency and productivity and so forth. How do these ideas relate to one another? And it seems that resilience could very well be a new keyword or core concept that serves as the anchor for a particular kind of thinking about the world and acting in it. Now, when I started thinking about the kind of problem resilience is, I immediately went back to thinking about a piece that I had read while I was in grad school, a piece that many of you have probably read, on a piece called Dilemmas in a General Theory of Planning, written by Horace Riddle, a famous professor of design, and Melvin Weber, an urban planner. How many people have heard of this concept? Not too many. How many people have actually read it? Okay. How many people have read it recently? Okay, I would urge you, I think, if nothing else, my talk would urge you to go back and look at it. Not the Wikipedia page.
Say it again,
Dilemmas in a General Theory of Planning, and I'll give full cites and so forth. Because they identify a whole set of problems that are basically resistant to being resolved within a traditional scientific and engineering paradigm. They talk about most issues of social policy are actually wicked, and we need to sort of recognize what they are and what the limits of our tools are. And since in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through all of these, but essentially these are problems that are very, very hard to define. They keep on going whether our attention is focused on them or not. They're recurrent. We have to constantly deal with them. There are no do-overs. Everything we try to do to solve a problem creates a new path dependency that changes the ground in which we work in. And we need to start thinking about these things not only as interconnected, but inherently ambiguous, and that one of the things that makes them so wicked and difficult to deal with is extreme social fragmentation. People have different ideas about what the problem is, even if they agree what the problem is, about the significance of it, and the solutions, and how we will know that the problem is moving towards some kind of resolution. But one of the reasons I asked you to go back and read the whole thing is that when you look at the Wikipedia page, it has the 10 attributes of a wicked problem. But the real interesting part for me is why these guys, fairly serious, sober scientists, Berkeley in the 70s, came up with this notion. And it wasn't just that, oh, this doesn't work, but it doesn't work because it does not solve for the challenge and problem of social equity and deal with all these social movements that have evolved late 60s, early 70s that contested the established order of things. And I think they were really, I think very reflective about what the limits of science were, because up until that time, science didn't have any limits. I mean, there was nothing that we couldn't puzzle out and solve and control and break down. I think we've returned to that point of view without necessarily thinking about it so much. There's a bunch of related concepts that since then, wicked problems has sort of fallen out of usage, as the fact that many of you have never heard of it. Social messes, which I think is even more accurate but harder to internalize as a scientific paradigm, or super wicked problems, which add a couple of dimensions that time is running out. And we think about here a game of soccer rather than football when players don't even know how much time is left in the game. No centralized authority. People who are trying to solve the problem are really causing it in many ways. and hyperbolic discounting, which is a fancy behavioral economics term for kicking the can down the road over and over and over again, focusing on near term rather than far term. So contemporary relevance. I think this is very important because recent advances in technology, hanging a lot of folks who talk about big data and genomics and brain science, the sort of thing is that somehow the frontier of tameable versus wicked has been pushed fairly far forward. And I don't know if that's the case. I'm not arrogant enough to say that that's definitely not the case, but I have questions, in part because I don't think contemporary science has really continued to pose that kind of question at all. It may very well be that there are. Maybe we have changed. The world has changed remarkably since 1973 in many ways. Our technological and technique and sophistication have increased dramatically. But I think we need to sort of investigate to see whether or not this is indeed the case and what the limits of our scientific explanations are. When I was thinking a lot about resilience, it struck me that it had many resemblances to the concept and the term community. And in some ways, I think community is also something that has a fair amount of wickedness or variability. It's also one of these things that's great to think. Everyone wants to be a member of community. Everyone wants to be part of something bigger than oneself. It's a very important part of our individual identity. The other side of community is that communities are as much defined by what they're not and who's not in them as what they are. So we tend to have this overly romanticized, inclusive, egalitarian notion of community, when in fact communities are very fragmented, divided, and often hierarchical. Rarely defined. And when I started looking in this literature on resilience and everyone talking about community resilience and developing indices of community resilience, and this is all well and good, but they don't define what community is. And since we're relying a lot upon communities to be the bearers and enactors of resilience, to be the component parts of cities and regions and states, I think we owe it to ourselves to have a bit more discipline and focus and have a clearer sense of the referent as to what communities mean. And this quote here, one of the few definitions of community from Carey, a group of individuals and organizations bound together by geography and perceived self-interest. What's missing here is any notion of shared identity and belonging, which is the spirit of communitas, which is the spirit of this, what Andrew referred to as a tribal identity and so forth, of belonging, of something that not only exists now in the present, but will exist in the future, and links you to people that you don't know, you will never meet. And builds that sense of shared purpose and integrity over time. There are at least 3 different dimensions of community. One that has been privileged, the spatial dimension of community, the official way we divide up cities into census tracts and zip codes, and the sort of limits and tyranny of the way in which that division does, because it doesn't correspond with how people view their community, define the boundaries, much less talk about the quality of social relationships that exist within it. But there's also a way in which community has been equated to neighborhood. But unofficially, but really powerfully, and not really thinking about cities. Sometimes people talk about cities as kinds of communities, or metropolitan regions. And clearly these are constructs of different orders. They require different ways of organizing, and they're not reducible to one another. But the key thing here is the disconnect between spatial units and social. There are so many other kinds of community that are not defined in reference to geography. They're defined in reference to social networks, and relationships. And these are by religion, language, race, ethnicity, occupation, or inclination. This is a learning community, a community of practice. There are epistemic communities. In fact, the definitions of community of practice is a whole book that doesn't even refer to these traditional kinds of communities at all. It's all about communities of professionals. And then the final sense, virtual communities. And this predates the internet, by the way. This goes back to the beginning of printing, mass communications, the ability to imagine a set of relationships to people that share or have something in common with you. I think the internet has sort of pushed this into a whole nother order of magnitude, but it is in some ways the history of the last 150 years. Just one little quick thing here. This is official set of neighborhood boundaries, and then what you have here are the boundaries of the people as defined by the people who live in it. So I think the big problem here, and this is Oakland, by the way, is tending to think of these official communities as natural systems. And in fact, when they bounce forward, they may very well bounce into something very, very different. And there's also an overlap and intersection between all these different geographies created by our systems. If I showed you a map of all the different kinds of geographic categories overlaying any current city, it would be basically incomprehensible. And there's that depth and thickness and confusion that really, I think, limits the way we can connect these different realms. Also, we think systems integration is really good. I think that sort of brings together a whole set of other challenges. Limits of traditional data. I'm running out of time, I can't really do this, but to sort of move to some of these big challenges, I think new ways of acquiring information about people who live in the urban landscape has the potential of dealing with and creating a tremendous amount of detailed data on which we can work. But it also has the tremendous potential to create whole new categories of administrative invisibility and exclusion. We will know more about some people than we ever had in the past. We will know more about them than they know themselves when you start taking a look about what they do and so forth. And this is very radical and revolutionary. But if you're not if you don't live online, you don't necessarily have that as part of, and these people are sort of invisible. Even in the past, we've been very good or very bad at excluding whole categories of people from the category of the public. We have the tendency here, I think, to magnify that even more. And of course, there's that whole Orwellian nightmare of new modalities of control, bias, exclusion, oppression, which is part and parcel, not necessarily a very negative way of thinking about it, but it's very much there, and it requires some very explicit conversations about how we go about setting social goals in common, establish priorities, and follow through. And I think my modest sort of observation in that the dialogue around resilience, sustainability, or for that matter, community development has a lot to go in that direction. And I'm hoping that we'll be able to sort of discuss this over the next 2.5 days. Thanks.